Really? Everybody?
That's trouble for me.
No.
Way less.
I'm not going to have time.
Right to you.
Is it coming through this at all? I'll fix it. I can't right now.
It's not gonna fall or anything like that. So whatever was left. They're probably as old as the church. Probably coming up on their 100 years. Yeah, please. Okay, maybe just spit my coffee. I place my hands on this machine all the time.
Make sure it goes in here. It's gonna work, Christine.
Speak it into it.
Lay hands on.
All right, good morning. It's nice to see you this morning. Happy Sunday. I really missed you guys last week. I came in the morning to worship with you guys, but my two nieces and my nephew were getting christened at the Episcopal Church. And I can tell you that the Episcopal Church is not like Emmanuel. So I missed you guys so much, and I rewatched everything the moment I got home, so I could feel like I was with you. But it's nice to be back. How many times have you read Scripture and thought, what in the world does this have to do with me? I usually feel that way in Numbers and Leviticus. I always feel that way in Leviticus. But then there are some other scriptures like husbands and wives and children that I think, oh, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not married and I don't have any children of my own. Trust me, God gives me 24 children a year and I have for 22 years, so I'm good. But the thing is, there's always something to gain out of His Word. We just have to be willing to find it. Today we're going to be looking at Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 9. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality in him. So we start off today with the word bondservant. In some translations, it says slave, because a bondservant is a slave or a servant. The word bondservant is the translation of the Greek word doulos and the Hebrew word abed. This morning's verses are about slavery. I don't know about you, but I've never owned a slave, and I've never been someone's family slave. So at first glance, I might think that these verses do not apply to me, but that is not true. This is one of those passages that can mean different things to different people as well. To those in the past who have condoned slavery, they often use these verses to support it. To those who have never had a slave and these verses upset them, they use these verses because God is not condemning slavery in this passage. You know as well as I do that people use Scripture often out of context to prove their point of view, and that certainly doesn't teach us anything. Slavery has been an issue in human lives since well before the Mosaic Law. And there are still horrific forms of slavery today in 2025, right here in the United States, and right here in some of your own neighborhoods. It always takes me a realistic movie or a TV show or the actual news to remind me of the horrors that can happen right next to us, and we have no idea. Did you know it is estimated today that there are 49.6 million people in the world who are subject to slavery right now? Now that's out of 8.2 billion people who live on the earth right now. Both of these statistics blow my mind. Do you ever take a moment to think, well, it might just be me because my mind goes off on weird rabbit trails, but do you ever think that Adam or Eve or Noah would have thought that 8.2 billion people would be on the earth at one time? I just can't imagine that they fathomed that. In our present day, in this world, 49.6 million are forced labor, sex trade, inheritable property, child labor, and the list goes on and on. So crazy to think about this, because in my 3 square little mile world, I don't see it. Last week, Jody shared about the relationship between parents and children, and before that, Erica shared about husbands and wives. So why does Paul go into slaves and masters next? I think it's important to note that in the first century, many slaves were actually domestic servants, which meant they were actual members of a household. So Paul speaking about husbands and wives, and then parents and then children, would make sense to go into slaves and masters next, because in many Roman families, this would actually be a part of their family unit at this time. Slavery here in the Roman world that Paul was addressing, remember, he's writing letters to the Corinthians, the Ephesians, so we need to remember first, like 60 AD slavery, and not the slavery that we have in our minds. But I think we often think about slavery with having to do with race or ethnicity, and our minds immediately go to American slavery. Remember, Paul was writing this letter at 62 AD, and at that time, the Roman world would have had an average of 60 million people. I thought that number was startling as well. Of that 60 million, about 30 to 40% of the population were constituted as slaves at the time that Paul was writing. It is true that prior to Paul, the Roman Empire did used to acquire their slaves through spoils of war, but men and women could become slaves in a number of ways when Paul is writing. Children of slaves were automatically owned by their masters. Abandoned children could be brought up as slaves, and people could even sell themselves into slavery to pay a debt. Slavery in Paul's day was based more on social, economic, and political status rather than on race and ethnicity, as we are probably more familiar with in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. The actual daily tasks of slaves during the time really depended on their skills. It depended on what region or city they lived in as well. So slaves could have been serving with menial jobs like cleaning, or they could have been doing something more harsh like mining. They could have been cooks, tutors, gardeners, or even doctors. This is why most Christians in the first century could tolerate slavery because it was tolerable. When Paul uses the word bondservants, many chose to stay a slave and often would pierce their ear so that others would know that they decided to remain a slave and stay with that family. Of course, slaves could have been abused, but that really was based on the temperament of their master. Much like spouses can be abused because of the temperament of their spouse, and children can be abused because of the temperament of their parent. So that really depended on the temperament of the person. But good slaves were an investment to their masters, and they gained more from treating them well. If they abused or underfed the slaves, then the masters are only hurting their own personal investment because they're not going to get a good product out of them if they're not being fed well or treated well. So masters could set their slaves free at any time as well. I thought this was interesting. When the slave was freed, they would take their master's name, and they were granted in many cases the same social status as their master in the Roman Empire at this time. This also meant that the slave population started to change over time because the Roman law actually allowed rights to be gained by these slaves. So based on these facts, it shows that by the time Paul wrote this letter, slavery was radically different from what it used to be when only non-Romans were slaves. Remember, Romans had Hebrew slaves. Like if you remember all the way back to that time of slavery, it's much different than what we're talking about in the first century. By the time this letter was written, slaves included both Romans and non-Romans. In fact, Paul in his writing never specifically condones slavery or condemns it. In 1 Corinthians 7:21, it says, "Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you. But if you get a chance to be free, take it." And then in 2 verses later, in verse 23, sorry, I didn't change that, it says, "God paid a high price for you, so don't become slaves by man." So Paul here is clearly not condoning slavery. In fact, he's saying you can be free, be free. And he's saying if you are free, don't submit to slavery. Like, don't try to pay that debt off by becoming a slave. Do something else. Today, thankfully, most societies as a whole have banned slavery. So for us, we look at this passage through the eyes of an employer or employee relationship. I know it essentially looked different, but if you think about it, they were basically taking on these people to live in their families and paying them to work for them is kind of what the slave looked like at that point. So it looked different, but the practices of both institutions were similar. Basically, it doesn't matter if you're a student, a salaried employee, an hourly employee, a manager, a CEO, or a business owner. Paul's words of submission apply to each and every one of us today. I really want to look at this passage and understand its intentions when Paul wrote the words of what it meant for the Ephesians, but I also want to know what it meant for us now to teach us. So if you really, really look at this passage, God is going after our hearts, and he is getting to the heart of the matter. Paul is talking to believers in this letter and wants our hearts to change, and he wants us to learn that being a servant is how we should act for Christ, because we are one with him as believers. Now that you have some historical basis, I think it's time to read these verses again. Last Saturday, some of you were here, I had the blessing to be part of the homegoing I had the blessing to be here as part of the homegoing service for our dear Lonnie Clayton. Lonnie and Gloria started Emmanuel at the same time that I did 20 years ago this April. We joined the church together 20 years ago this July, and they were standing up there when we got to become members together. So Lonnie and Gloria have always been a wonderful part of my heart. At one point during the service, Lonnie's son Matt shared some neat truths about his dad. But the one that stuck out to me the most was that dear Lonnie would read the Bible through in a year, every single year. But every time he read it, he would read it in a different version because he wanted to learn something new with fresh eyes. So something that he might not have learned before. So in honor of Lonnie, and just because whenever I study for Sunday school, I always read the verses in different translations, I'm going to ask you to read along with me in a few different translations this morning. Other than the ESV that I usually base my lessons on. So my Bible that I share each week from is the English Standard Version, but I want to take a look at this morning the New American Standard Bible, the New Living Translation, and the Message. Now, before I do that, because there are some people that might be sitting here going, the Message, no. And I just want to explain, if you're newer to the Bible, I want to take a moment to explain this the best I can, the quickest I can. There are many translations of the Bible. Each translation of the Bible follows certain translation principles that affect its final work. So some translations are meant to be literal, and they are trying for exact word-for-word correspondence as much as possible. Others try to be dynamic and thought for thought, providing an overall meaning of the text in modern language, not necessarily providing for word correspondence. Basically, one translation might be better to study for one, and another might be better for public reading. One translation may help Pam understand it more, and a different translation may help Cindy understand it more. Translation is not an exact science. There is no perfect one-on-one correspondence between words in different languages. I can tell you, just this week this happened. I have two students in my class who need to speak through Google Translate to me. One is from Ecuador and one is from Mexico. One literally just came here 4 weeks ago and has never owned a coat before because he used to live on the beach in Mexico. And one came from a farm in Ecuador who has never been in school up until the end of last year. So they need Google Translate to speak to me. I do love how at the beginning of the year, they would just go like this, and now they walk up to me and they take my phone and they're walking around the room, and I'm like, please come take my phone. And they're having a conversation with me. If you're not familiar with what Google Translation is, it's an app on your phone where you find the language that they speak, and they can read into it, and then it translates it to me. But there are so many words, so many idioms, so many things we say in the English language that do not translate well, and things that they say in Spanish that do not translate well. So I want you to think of this example that I'm using in the lens of people taking Hebrew and Greek and changing it into English and Spanish and Turkish and everything, and what gets lost in translation. So I'm saying the word gum because I have gum in my classroom, and if sometimes I pass out a piece of gum just to help my kids keep focused, and they love that. So I say gum, and Juan Marco in my class doesn't understand what I'm saying. So I translate it in Spanish, and it's goma. So I say goma. I'm probably not saying it right, but I say goma. So when I use the term goma, both of them are looking at me. So I walk over and I pick up the piece of gum, and Axel says, "Oh, chocolata." And I was like, "Chocolata? You remember the chiclet gum that we had?" Okay, well, they just go by a name brand, and then that becomes how their culture learned it. So both of them knew chocolata, and they both like were, "Yeah, chocolata." And I was like, okay. So my point is, from Hebrew to Greek to the many translations, it gets lost. So this might help you. New American Standard Bible is what we use upstairs in our church. That's more of a word-for-word translation. And then you move to the New King James and ESV. You might move right through. Maybe you're a thought-for-thought person, and NIV and NLT stands out for you. And then you move down to more of a paraphrase, the Living Bible and the Message and the CEV. They're kind of paraphrase Bibles. So when you get down to the Message, it's like, yo, Jesus, here I am. I don't think the King James only people are going to like that version, but I think that there is a benefit to reading all of the versions, and sometimes you can understand something out of one that you can't in another. So I said that not to get off the subject, but I really want you to understand that. And I want to look at, I printed it for you, and if you're online, I posted it on our Facebook page for you. I just wanted you to take a look at these different verses. Actually, I'm going to ask, Lisa, would you read the New American Standard version? It's right on the sheet I gave you in front of you.
Oh.
You don't have to look it up or anything. Yeah. But I do know what you read. Yeah, that's why I asked you to read it.
So it says, slaves and masters. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With goodwill render service as to the Lord and not to the people, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, he will receive this back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same thing to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him.
Okay, so this is more your word-for-word translation. Now I'm going to ask somebody to read it in NLT for me. Okay, Kathleen, go for it. It's all yours, NLT.
Slaves and masters. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with deep respect and fear. Serve them sincerely as you would serve Christ. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all your heart. Work with enthusiasm, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will reward each one of you for the good we do, whether we are slaves or free. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Don't threaten them. Remember, you both have the same master in heaven, and he has no favorites.
And Donna Emery, I'm going to call on you to read the Message. I knew you knew I was going to call on you. So.
Okay, the Message. Servants, respectfully obey your earthly masters, but always with an eye to obeying the real master, Christ. Don't just do what you have to do to get by, but work heartily, as Christ's servants doing what God wants you to do. And work with a smile on your face, always keeping in mind that no matter who happens to be giving the orders, you're really serving God. Good work will get you good pay from the master, regardless of whether you are slave or free. Masters, it's the same with you. No abuse, please, and no threats. You and your servants are both under the same master in heaven. He makes no distinction between you and them.
Thank you. I thought it was interesting to read each and every verse, and out of that, I got 4 words that I want to talk about today. When we read these verses, we see that Paul is basically breaking up his advice into 4 adverbs: respectfully, sincerely, consciously, and pleasantly. That's how he wants us to work. That's how we are to work. When Paul first addresses masters in Ephesians 6:5, he is telling us that we as slaves, we need to respect our masters literally with fear and trembling. We need to obey them respectfully. This does not mean that we have to have a militant response to our bosses. Rather, it means we need to show them respect for the master's position and authority that they've been put in. Basically, Paul is saying that as workers, we are to carry out our boss's instructions with the same honor, the same respect, and the same submission that we read children should bestow on their parents, that Jody read last week. Children, obey your parents and the Lord, for this is right. We are to serve with the same kind of service that we would be serving Jesus himself. Fear and trembling refers to respect and humility that we should be giving our master's position and authority. We are to obey those who are in charge over us on this earth. Consider how broad this teaching reaches. Anyone who has rule or authority, we are to obey him. And I'm not going to go into it, but I want you to think about the people right now who have rule and authority over us and how many people are disrespecting the rule and authority that we are under. Notice the character of how we are to serve as we would serve Jesus. This is what is going through our minds when we go to work. We are going to serve and work as if we are working for Jesus himself. Paul tells us this means we will serve wholeheartedly and genuinely. Obedience to Jesus is with a sincere heart, and we need to offer that same heart to our masters. I think it's important to notice that there's no excuse if we have bad masters. Paul does not say you don't have to serve with your whole heart if your master really stinks or if he's a terrible boss. Okay, he doesn't say that. This usually is the justification that we use for half-hearted service. We say the person I'm working for is clueless, they don't know what he or she is doing, therefore I'm not going to work hard for them because I don't respect them. Just because you don't respect them, they are in a position where we have to respect them. And we convince ourselves that we should feel justified in our response. So we need to overcome this thinking with determination to obey and to serve the Lord from the heart as an expression of our commitment to the Lord. There is always a statement that Pat Cook, for those of you who knew her, used to make that stands out in my head, and it stood out as I studied these verses. We are serving an audience of one. That means when you are serving your boss coffee, or doing an assignment for your high school chemistry teacher, or keeping your apartment clean for your landlord, or paying taxes to the government, or you're playing a soccer game for your coach, or you're doing a project for your manager, you are called to serve as you would serve Jesus. Always. Jesus always sees how we respond. So that's how we should be serving. Lila will laugh, and Kathleen, because they know that I keep this in my pocket. But I actually keep a little Jesus in my pocket. Okay, he's my little Jesus, okay? And I keep my little Jesus in my pocket. And there was a meeting that I went to this week that I had my hand in my pocket holding my little Jesus to remind me that I serve an audience of one. And it was a hard meeting, but I held on to that little Jesus just to help me focus on him, because that's what I needed. As we need to serve as we are serving an audience of one. Imagine if Jesus walked in here and said, Terry, I want you to mop the floor. You would do it. Imagine if Jesus was telling you to do a computer task. Imagine if Jesus was telling you to do the work. Work with that kind of attitude. Why should we serve this way? Because Paul in 1 Corinthians in 10:31 says, so whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. Basically, carry out your assignment with honor, humility, honesty, and with integrity. Serve with integrity is what he talks about in verse 6. We are to avoid eye service, which means serving with a view of impressing others. We are not to strive to be people pleasers, which means focusing on appearances only. I know that Kathleen will say, I'm a people pleaser, and I am. I'm worried about what you think, but I'm not serving for what you think. Okay, just wanted to point that out. All right. Paul shows us that how we serve matters to the Lord. Basically, the people pleaser part of me is I'll be crying hysterically if you're disappointed in me, but that's my own issue. Okay. So we are not to work only when the boss is watching. This is something that happens all the time and all around us. How many will only work when the master is watching? And if he's gone, little work is done. Bottom line is there's one master, and Paul wants us to remember that. Our master is in heaven, and we have chosen to follow him. I want him to be my master because he is my king. So we need to think about this in our daily lives. When we go to work or go to school, we need to work solely thinking that he is watching us. As a teacher in New Jersey, you get observed often, and there's this dread as a teacher. I don't know if you remember that dread, Cindy, when you were like as a teacher, when your observer walks in, that your students are going to misbehave, or that you're going to forget. In our new word, we have to teach the kids the learning intention of every lesson and the success criteria of every lesson, or you're afraid that the students aren't going to answer one of your questions right, and you're going to look like you failed as a teacher. The first observation of the year, every year in the state of New Jersey, is the only observation that is announced. So the principal will say, hey, I'm coming to you tomorrow at 1 o'clock, or I'm coming to you next Wednesday at 1:30. Be prepared. I need your lesson plans in advance. Then after that, it's unannounced. So basically, this year I got an email from my curriculum coordinator who says I'll be in sometime between November 15th and February 3rd for any lesson. Okay. So that's not helpful by any means. Because of the craziness of our school day, she didn't even come by the date she told me she was coming. She came after that. So I say that sarcastically. But it makes you feel less relaxed that you've been waiting at all these possible times for the master to come in with their laptop, okay? So I can tell you from experience that the minute the laptop leaves, I feel this sense of complete and utter relief. But does that mean I stop teaching my students? No, there's 22 of them. I can't stop teaching them or it would be mayhem. I might say, like, let's take a break. Let's do a 30-second dance party, right? Because they know they're being watched. We know we're being watched. But it's not a license for me to stop working. So even in your own jobs, people might waste time talking about everything rather than working hard. Maybe it's a water cooler chat, or maybe now with technology, you're sitting across the room and you're like, well, I see they're playing solitaire and they're on Facebook and they're not working, so why should I? But believers are called to be different. We are to work whether the boss is watching or not. Paul teaches that we cannot go to work and do as little as possible, for this is not how we serve Christ. Have you ever heard someone jokingly ask if another was working hard or hardly working? You've heard that statement, right? And if you say that you were working hard, they want to make fun of you. Because in their eyes, you're supposed to be hardly working. That's like the American mindset. But this cannot be our answer or our attitude as believers. There's a sitcom called Schitt's Creek, and it's their last name. It's SCHITTS. And I'm not condoning every part of this show by any stretch of the imagination. But there is one episode where David needs to renew his driver's license. And this just kept popping up to me. So he's very worried that he's going to fail, and the instructor is going to care about every detail of his performance. His sister Alexis tells him not to worry because the majority of people working in his world don't care. And she says, David, they don't care. David's nervous that he's going to make a little mistake and that his license isn't going to be renewed. So the driving instructor walks out to the car, and David's sister Alexis says, David, remember, nobody cares. Basically saying, nobody cares that this is the most important thing in your day. It's just a job to them. Alexis is saying, this is a big day for you, but this guy, he doesn't care. So David proceeds along the route, and he starts talking to his instructor. So you can see David is nervous, and he's looking at his instructor, who is looking at his phone. Okay? He's not paying attention to the route that they're going on. At one point, the instructor says, okay, Derek, when you get to the corner, I need you to make a right. And he goes, my name is David. Like, my name is not even Derek. Are you in the right car? And this drives David, no pun intended, drives, okay. This drives David to say, do you care about your job? And this guy says, yeah, you're like my 8th guy today, so no, I don't really care. And he's like, no, man, I want to be a DJ when I grow up. Like, this was his most important part of his day, and this guy was not doing his job. And I share this because that's sadly how most of the world performs at their jobs. It's a paycheck. It's what gets them to the next thing. It's what's going to move them up the next rung of the ladder. But we as believers are to give our all, no matter what rung of the ladder we're on. It doesn't matter if you're the driver or the manager at the DMV. His job was to make sure that he was passing his test and doing what was right. So we need to remember that we need to always be working hard for the Lord. We need to serve for a heavenly reward, as it says in Ephesians 6:8. Verse 8 gives another reason why we work with all our heart and obey our masters. We are to know that we will be rewarded by God. This helps us overcome the feeling that our employer is taking advantage of us. And I'm sure that many of these slaves in the Roman Empire were regularly being taken advantage of. I'm sure there were some slaves that were taken very well care of, and I'm sure there's some that weren't. Probably many wanted to run away. But this feeling of injustice and sense of fairness always leads us in American workforce today to steal some supplies from work, or work half-heartedly, or steal that time that's not really ours to take. Taking personal time when we should be working, that's not what we would be doing if Jesus was standing right there. We wouldn't have that attitude. Taking advantage of our situation because we think we deserve it. We can fight this by recognizing that we give in our work is seen by God and will be rewarded. Paul says, whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord. God cares so much about the work that we give to our masters that he will reward us for the work that we do. So when we get to heaven, you'll be rewarded for doing that annual report. You're going to be rewarded, Cindy, for singing in praise team. You're going to be rewarded, Joanne, for sitting in the back under the stairwell in a room with a bunch of canned foods to give out to people. You're going to be rewarded for doing the AV team upstairs, right? We're all serving him, and that's when we're going to be rewarded. So you might not get your applaud now. You might not get it. Nobody might notice that you're sitting under there in your little food pantry, Joanne. Somebody might point out the one mistake that you make in the entire annual report. They will, trust me, they will every time. But that's not what it's about. Her reward is in heaven because Jesus sees that she was there on Friday night at 7 o'clock working on the annual report, right? That's what matters. Work is one of the places where we spend a significant amount of time each day. And if you're retired, it's probably a different venue for you. Maybe you're taking care of grandkids, or maybe you're serving at church, or maybe you're working at the food bank. The work is how we show that we serve Jesus first and foremost, even if we don't like what we're doing or if we're treated poorly. Basically, all of us need to embrace servanthood. This is so opposite of the worldly, especially American approach to work. We are always working to get to the top. We are always thinking more, more, more. We are always striving to be in charge. It's natural America. But we're called to serve one another. We're not called to be in charge of one another. You are not any less because of the position you hold. Not everyone is called to be the boss. Not everyone is called to be the principal. Not everyone is called to be the lawyer or the doctor. Some are called to be the assistant. Some are called to be the nurse. Some are called to be the vice president. Some are called to be what others would consider the bottom of the pay scale. But Christ loves the church as he gave everything up for us. What was Jesus doing when he walked the streets? Was he walking around demanding that people follow him? No. He was actually telling the little children to come to him. He was meeting with Pharisees at night. He was watching the disciples' feet. He wasn't doing it for eye service or people pleasing. He was doing it for his Father in heaven. We have this mindset that we need to keep advancing, and honestly, that is what Satan has done to human beings. That is not from the Lord. Putting in our minds that we're not good enough unless we become more knowledgeable or more in charge or more powerful. I mean, Satan tried to tempt even Jesus himself to have more if he did this, right? We follow this pattern of the world, as it says in Ephesians 2. It's natural to fall into this promotion thinking, but we shouldn't really care as believers because all of our work is important. In Philippians 2, 5, and 8, it says, "Have this mind among yourself, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Third graders in general have this belief that someone's going to do it for them. I'm not blaming them. This is what they're being raised in. But their thought is, I can drop all my pencils and crayons on the floor and the janitor will clean it up. And when I have snack that's hard to open, I'm just going to hand it to Mrs. Emery and she's going to open it for me. And when I need to tie my shoe, I'm going to just put my shoe in front of my teacher and I'm going to say, "Hey, can you tie it for me?" It's also third grade, so they have to be cool about it. So they come up to me and they say, "Bruh, can you tie my shoe?" And I'm like, "I'm not your bruh, but I'll show you how to do it," right? I'm not your personal cleaning task, so you're going to have to clean that up yourself. I'm not your personal snack owner, but I'm going to remind you that you know where the scissors are and you can open that up yourself. I have this little girl named Sammy in my class, and Sammy is one of those students you just fall in love with. Why? Because she has a soft heart and there's no job too little for Sammy. Sammy's had 5 heart surgeries from birth to 2 years of age. Sammy has gastroparesis and intestinal tubes coming out of her, which every night she needs to be fed for 8 hours, where a nurse has to come and sleep at her house. Sammy sometimes needs to stand because her tubes get in her way. Sammy has broken her wrist because she fell off the monkey bars at school this year and was in a cast for over 6 weeks. She also just found out she has asthma and spent 2 nights at CHOP. Yet Sammy is the one who picks up the tissues when someone misses the trash can. Sammy is the one who held the trash can for Charlotte, everything was emptying up out of her, and walked her all the way down to the nurse just a few weeks ago. Sammy is the one who will sit next to the meanest of students, and she does it all with that smile. You see, Sammy has a servant's heart, and she puts herself lower than everyone else. She doesn't sit there and go, "I picked up a tissue. I think I should get this," which my other kids do. Sammy just does it because it's indwelt in her. She obeys her teacher. She obeys her principal. She obeys her parents. And I just want you to think about that. And I know I'm running out of time. But when I was on my first missions trip to Oaxaca, Mexico, I witnessed the pastor leave the pulpit and go and collect the trash and clean the bathrooms that we were staying in. A few weeks ago at prayer meeting, I heard your husband, Joanne, I heard your husband say there's no toilet paper in the bathroom upstairs. And Pastor Vince went and got the toilet paper and put it in the stall upstairs. I'm saying this because that is what our life is about. I don't think anybody knew that he put the toilet paper in there. I don't think anybody else heard the conversation. I just happened to be upstairs. And that's what it's all about, right? We're supposed to be